Hi everyone, it's Amanda here. I wanted to do my presentation for this week on Medieval Manuscripts, Media Archaeology, and the Digital Incunable by Martin Foys. And I was really interested by this article and the ways that it's discussing the digitization process of manuscripts. And so I just kind of wanted to discuss some of the things that were really interesting and also some of the things that I found pretty problematic throughout this article. To begin with, I just wanted to start with looking at some images of the manuscript because, interestingly enough, Martin Foys talks about the privileging of the digitization process in terms of the images, but doesn't actually include any in their article. And since this article was published, there have been a more complete digitization process that's happened in which all of the leaves of the manuscript in both the separate versions of it have been recorded. And so it's no longer just those four pictorial representations that Foys is pointing to, and these two are just kind of like title pages, so you can see Tiberius, and then in the ways in which Cotton's name has been inscribed onto one of the leaves. And then this is just a couple more of the manuscript, and I think the image on the left was one of the first images that was made public in that first digitization process by the British Library that Foys is talking about. And so digging into the reading more so, I wanted to first think about the manuscript as a site of palimpsest and the ways that Foys is also kind of categorizing it that way. And so I wanted to open this with this quote that Foys has that says, "Tiberius today is a negotiation of temporal forms, a sorting through of material survival and this material's modification, documentary records, and multiple reproductions in the multiple modes of media. Tiberius is thus far an artifact in two ways. It is a human product from the past, but it is also a product in the present, still subject to alteration through external processes, the augmentation and modification of its original form, critical treatments in its printed facsimiles and scholarship, and most recently, rearticulation in electronic and digital media." And so I'm really trying to get at this idea of palimpsest, in which Foys talks about the ways that this manuscript underwent dramatic changes under Cotton's possession in terms of like the removal, reordering, and additions of leaves. And so I just kind of want to think about the ways that this might be a helpful way to think about a medieval manuscript and thinking about the ways that an archivist or like a book collector slash owner like Cotton also interacts with this palimpsest is the manuscript. And so some of the questions that I was interested in from this are kind of like how this quote is addressing a specific type of media in the archive. I think that the way that Foys is conceptualizing artifact is very limited to printed or like more canonical ideas of archival objects, manuscripts, prints, things like that. And so I wanted to ask how objects of ephemera or performances like challenge that way of the conceptualization of the artifact. And I want to think about if it's helpful to think about an object being a product of the past and present simultaneously and sort of what those connotations are. And I was also interested in the way that Cotton's reordering and additions in the manuscript reminded me of like questions of archivist interventions that we've been having in terms of how an archivist is shaping our perspective of an archival object and how are we negotiating the narratives that are being constructed through that archivist. And something else that Foys touches on a lot is the idea of the network. And so they have this quote in which Tiberius becomes a work that is now a network located both within its various historical forms and the subsequent media that continue to reproduce and transform it. And then digitization increasingly has the potential to network parts of individual items directly together through linked associations. This digital record of these materials does not reproduce all of them, though they could theoretically do this too, but it does transform them, presenting them together within the same medium and significantly linked within the same temporal moment. And so I was really interested in this idea of the network, and I was wondering what you all thought the network was, how the network is being conceptualized, and if just simply by digitizing things, are they placed in the same temporal moment? And I'm also wondering what types of flattening and erasures are happening through this verticalization of everything all at once. And then something else I was really interested in Foy's article was sort of what's happening with the images, and a few portions of Tiberius were digitized, as Foy states, but those have all shown the ways that the digitization process is privileging the visual or the pictorial. And so they say, instead of networking the concept of the manuscript, this digital treatment fragments Tiberius, isolating parts of it from the context of the whole. And Tiberius barely exists digitally, and what of it that does suggest that the manuscript should be treasured as a storehouse of individual visual images, a valuation reminiscent of the hypervisuality promoted by typographic culture. And so I was really thinking about this, and I'm thinking that Foy's is trying to challenge this in terms of considering the textual and the visual, but I'm not sure if they fully get there, because I think that there's a way in which kind of criticizing how the digitization process has just solely privileged the visual. There's almost a secondary importance of the visual that seems to be happening by proximity of this argument. And so that's just something that I'm really interested in thinking across, because I am really interested in looking at medieval manuscripts and early modern books in the ways that text and image are working alongside each other, and the ways in which they need to be considered alongside of each other. And so I'm thinking about the images further, and I kind of have these questions. So Foy seems critical of the textual details in the manuscript being left out of the digitization process. The pictorial representations are somewhat legible, but are scans of the text accessible at all? Digitization seems to be gesturing towards a dissemination and accessibility for, quote, all to have access to look at manuscripts, but to echo Chelsea's point, what is the point of looking at a scanned copy of a manuscript that is making no effort to actually be accessible? And so I wanted to return to this image of the manuscript here, and I'm wondering, what is the point of looking at it in terms of understanding it textually, as Foy seems to be getting at, in that we are privileging the pictorial in the early digitization process, but in digitizing this image, what is it doing? Why are we even looking at it? Because it's not accessible to someone who isn't trained in paleography, isn't trained in medieval Latin. And so I was also thinking about this project in tandem with that, which is Lady Mary Ross Poetry, where on the far left there is a copy of the original, in which is in her handwriting, and then in the middle is kind of a facsimile of sorts of the early modern spelling and text, and then on the right is a translated and sort of glossed edition of that poem. And so I'm thinking about how in this digitization process of medieval manuscripts, how integrating something like this would be so crucial in actually making a text accessible, which is what digitization is trying to pride itself about, and is actually continually failing to do. And so bringing into conclusion in terms of Foy, they say that we now have the technological capacity to imagine and to strive for digital architectures that can represent a manuscript's deep time, formal iterations, and shifting contents, and integrate these aspects in a network of the past, present, and future scholarship. Like an early printed book, our incunabler desires for digital manuscript study have yet to realize their own efficient limits. And so after reading this, I wanted to think about the ways that Foys is failing to interrogate the very fact that this is the British Library holding the manuscript and the very hierarchies and violence that their collections inscribe and inhibit in terms of searching for accessibility through the technological capacity of the digitization project. And just some final questions in thought. How is the digitization process working in your own archives? How does digital space affect the archival objects you are working on? And can we revisit the ways that digitization, especially within museum holdings, is fronting as accessibility, but isn't actually working to make these objects accessible aside from placing them online in a database of sorts? Thank you, and I'm so excited to hear all of your thoughts.